absolutely thrilled to be here, and this really does kick off not only for me a lecture series, but a long history that I've had supporting this incredible group. I remember coming here, and I'm sure many of you do too, when this was an armory. For TV5, we came in, and this was during the big deployment and everything. Thank you. We saw the soldiers that were here. So when this transformed itself, and of course the old museum was so tiny, to grow into this, it just meant major things. And then when they added the Maritime floor, bang, slam dunk for me. I loved it. So we've got still pictures up in this that we've taken on some of our dive adventures, and so much history that I absolutely love. You know, for me, everybody always asks me, what's next? How do you find your next project? And usually my answer is, it finds me. I'll go in and I'll do a story, and something will just hook it, and I'll say, wow, that makes a lot of sense. And for this, it was a shipwreck that we found 2 summers ago off of Whitefish Point. And that shipwreck, when they went down, they said, did you know that there was a bulldog on this shipwreck? I said, really? And they said, yeah, the bulldog was saved by the first mate. And as I dug, I said, I know who the first mate was. He actually runs into a couple of my other stories. He was on 17 shipwrecks. So the story of the dog, yeah, who sails with somebody that was? But they ended up doing it, and the dog story was so good that I remembered several other dog stories, and some of them are tied to Bay City. Some of them are tied to our Thumb area, 2 very famous shipwrecks up there. Many of them have incredible outcomes. Many of them have very tragic outcomes, and some of them are absolute BS. So I will let you figure out what they are. Now, I'd promised the museum, because when we first started, they said, will you have books ready by January? Oh, yeah, no problem. The book is written, the cover is done, everything's ready. I even bought the barcode, which, what a highway robbery it is to get an ISBN. Those things are $150 just to have a barcode. So, and then once you buy $300 worth of barcodes, they end up charging you $25 to print it. So just so you know, when you become an author, yeah, people, how much money do you make? None. But I saw this little doggy in this picture, and I absolutely had to put him on the cover, because I didn't realize that there were animals that actually went on board these ships. And of course, if you were the oiler or you were a deckhand, you didn't get to bring your pet. But if you were the chief engineer or you were the captain, you could bring whatever you wanted. And so we get these incredible stories, enough to now make a 300-page book with 22 chapters of dogs. So I can't wait to share some of my favorites. And look at this guy. This is a lonely business, and I will admit too that this is actually on the ocean. The fishing boats were my best source, because we always had a local family that would own the boat, and you'd have more opportunities. So this is more in Massachusetts, but not uncommon for the boats that we had on the Great Lakes that quite often had a lot of shipwrecks. We've talked before, how many people have heard my Douglas Houghton talk when we talked about salt on the Great Lakes? Some of you did. I need to touch on this, because Mimi is the wonder dog in this entire story. We don't normally get to know the names of the pets, but when the owner loves their pets so much that they actually write about them, you know that gives us some more work. One of the criticisms of my book, my wife read it through, and she's looking, she goes, you don't have a lot of dogs in here. I said, yeah, well, people don't necessarily write a whole chapter about their dog. You know, I can get a lot about where the ship was built or what happened in the storm, the meteorological output of what happened, but the chapter on the dog is so hard to try to glean stuff out of, and that's certainly true of this. But Doug Houghton, of course, came into a state right when we basically were formed, and they said, by the way, we know there's some copper resources. I think that there's some iron ore, and of course, when they went up by Negaunee, their compass just spun like this. They realized that these resources were in the ground, so they decided to hire him as our state geologist, the very first one. So he's a medical doctor who had an incredible background in geology, and they start just unleashing him upon the state of Michigan to figure out what was there. And as we know, he took off in Royal Oak in a stagecoach and went all the way up to Byron and put a canoe in, and went all the way up to what is now present-day Corunna, naming all the big rocks that were there, and some of them are actually still up that way as you get around, especially going into St. Charles. And then the devastation of what happened to all the Native American villages, the sad fact that smallpox had come in and just devastated the population, where Midland was an empty outpost of what used to be a Native American settlement. So that as he came in, he was documenting that. It also led him, as a medical doctor, to start inoculating a lot of these Native Americans too. So as he went on the big expeditions that we cover in the book, going all the way out to the borders of Michigan, as we're going to Minnesota and the Wisconsin area, where we had some conflicts on where they should do it, he would go out there and inoculate the Native Americans and actually give them protection against this sickness that by then the white people had pretty much knocked down to where we could control it. And sadly, there were all those stigmas with whether or not it would work. And of course, he writes about how they don't believe him that it'll work, and it's pretty incredible. So, yep, he goes into the Saginaw River. He goes up into the Tittabawassee and the Salt River right up here, and that's so briny that the Native Americans said, you know, they called it the Salt River, and that's because this underground ocean was feeding this salt water down from a source that's almost 1,000 feet below. This is back during the Devonian period, 400 million years ago, before the dinosaurs, before fish, you know, were out there. Just these shelled coral animals were there. It's interesting to read, and you can go online if you want to learn more. Read the Bentley Library accounts. They have scanned every one of his diaries. So Houghton's, all of his accounts are there that you can read. And as he goes around Ottawa Bay, which is now Tawas, as he went in here, he said the mosquitoes ate them alive. So they had this gauze that they could put around their canoes when they were traveling, but mostly at night when they'd put up their tents, they'd put this thin gauze as some kind of a protection against these mosquitoes. That is, he said he ascended over here, it just got eaten alive and got back in and wanted to get out to the water because they wouldn't at least be, you know, eaten pretty much. Fishing Point, all these areas are now renamed as we go up, but it's interesting to see all of his maps that he would draw and how close they were to what they really look like. I mean, you're using a sextant to figure out what your latitude and longitude line is, and then drawing out using your compasses to figure out what direction everything's going. And they got Michigan pretty close to what it was. So now as we go into outer space and really look at it, it's pretty amazing to see what it looks like. The maps that they did, especially up into the Keweenaw area, were really significant because the copper was really on fire at this time. If you think about, they find this massive boulder near Ontonagon, and the Native Americans have always known about it. They thought it had magical powers, and they go out there and they take these chisels and they break 5 chisels trying to get a chunk off of this big natural copper that they put into these canoes and take it all the way out to actually put it into a boat. And there's a big fight over who would get this boulder. And now it's at the Smithsonian, but it was a drawn out story of how they finally got it out and how the government tried to take it over many times. But the whole survey is really fun to go through and to read. And as you start to read, especially as they go in here and they realize all of this has to be laid out as townships so they could actually start to give mineral rights out to it, you know, specific areas so that the companies wouldn't be fighting over the copper. Think about this time when the telegraph lines are going up, all of the instruments that came out, when they realized the purity of this quality of this copper was better than what they were finding even in England, everybody wanted Michigan copper in their instruments because they felt it would be better for the you know, instrumentation, the quality of it. So they had all these companies from around the world that were starting to clamor for getting a mine up here. And so they said, well, we'll bring you in then and we'll make a detailed survey. And the people that he brings in, the last names as you look at them are pretty interesting. Hubbard, look at Houghton Lake, all these places that have big names for them are all these geologists and especially the surveyors that would come in and get these major lakes named for them, which is pretty cool. Now, as I found this, I found some maps too, and this is the first that I've seen where they were actually going through Eagle River and the first veins that were being found. And some of this seems really suspect to me because as he starts to go into these areas, all of a sudden his brother-in-law starts to get invested. So he's representing the state and going in and making all these notes, and he says down here on his map, this area is not so good. And then all of a sudden you see his brother-in-law move into this area and put the very first mine up there, and you're like, wait a minute. Now, I'm not calling Doug out, okay? But I'm just saying that this seems a little suspect to Rick as I'm looking at it. But here you see the actual you know, here's the river system. This is how far in they put that first mine. And you can see actually where they drew out and they put in the first water wheel, all of this major industry that's coming into the UP that has nothing. At that time, Marquette was called Carp River. There really was nothing in the Upper Peninsula, but it's booming here because all of this riches are being taken out. One of my favorite things to find were the letters that were written back and forth. And in the book, I go into a lot of detail of Houghton talking to his brother. His brother's like, I don't know what I'm going to do with my life. I probably should come work for you. And he goes, listen, hey, I'm working for a group and there's not a place for you right now. But then he goes into these amazing pep talks that he gives to him about how your world is your oyster, you know, and you don't worry, you know, look, be like me and grab it by the, you know, by the neck. And it's amazing to see a brother, especially I'm the oldest brother of 7 kids, so you know you kind of have to have that role of being the pep talk guy. But he goes into a lot of stuff about I was ready to give up, and it's neat to see this insight into this guy now that we have a city named for a lake and such. And also Bradish, this guy that's a fantastic artist, and he comes out and he starts saying, I need to do some paintings of all these people. Now, Bradish, in many of his notes, he's trying to convince the governors and especially the leadership in Canada, you should pay me to paint you, you know, because I'm very famous. So he's trying to get all this work, but he's also begging the geologist, yeah, you're pretty significant, you know, you're finding neat stuff, we should paint your picture. And they really don't do a good picture of him until, sadly, after he gets killed. But the notes as you go through are pretty incredible. So as you go through the diaries and you realize that not only was he on this, he left Eagle Harbor and came into a small boat with 4 other guys and his dog Mimi, and they go down here and they start visiting some areas, and we still don't know to this day why he stopped off. He took some supplies down to a storehouse about 5 miles east of Eagle River and found out that the guy he wanted to talk to wasn't there. So he ended up going down the coast of the Keweenaw towards Ontonagon and somehow got whatever he needed to do there and turned around, and the guys in the canoe said, listen, it's getting pretty stormy, we should probably stop. This whole area has a couple of pockets of rather large beaches that would have been very easy for them to pull in. He goes, no, we've got to get back because one of our guys has to catch the boat. There's only one boat that's leaving Eagle Harbor, and we have to get up to that harbor to do it. So they push on until the waves start to break over their big canoe, their bateau. And as they're going in, now they're saying, hey, we have to go in. And finally he relents. So he says, okay, get, you know, your protection on. I guess he had a life belt that they could take out of this bag. And he said, let's get ready. And all of a sudden now it's a bluff. So they can't get to shore. And sadly, a big wave comes in and washes him out. And the last they have is 2 survivors of the 4 guys. And then says, I looked and I saw the dog. The dog was gone. There is one account that Mimi made it, but then there's no other traces that I can find. So I don't see that as a primary account. I don't think that, sadly, the puppy made it. But we know for sure that Houghton wasn't found right away until the next spring. And then they identified him by his boots, sadly, because he had initials inside of his boots. But 2 guys managed to get out. They dry off as best they can. They walk all the way into Eagle River with the bad news that this very celebrated doctor, this geologist, has passed away. And they put up this big boulder near the site where he actually went in, where he actually tipped over. And it's interesting because this is based on a famous painting that Bradish did. And so as I went into the actual resources that they have, as you go into the Detroit Library, they've got a fantastic Michigan selection there. And as you go in, you can find the notes. And this hammer actually shows up in one of Bradish's notes, where he starts talking about the hammer is actually told to him by one of the expedition guys that said, hey, listen, I think it was Hubbard himself that wrote down, this is what it looks like. It's heavier than a sledge, but sometimes we would use a sledge. This handwriting's horrible. And this is actually good handwriting, by the way, from some of the stuff. Some of it's written, it looks like a heartbeat on an EKG. And you're like, what is this? But you spend your time, and after a while you can read it. So they draw out the handle, and sure enough, here's the actual painting and a picture of Mimi that's on the beach here. And this was supposed to hang in Lansing. That was the big deal, was this, he's so significant, and they just couldn't get the legislatures to agree on where it should go. But I feel it went to the Michigan Tech University library. I think that's a wonderful place. The Mineral Museum is where they actually hang it. So I think that's a great spot for it. But all the letters were all of them trying to influence the senators and stuff to say, hey, this should really hang here. This is the story that influenced my book the most, and these pictures did not exist at first because I didn't know what would be available as we went into Georgian Bay to take a peek at what might be there. And sure enough, look at this dog right here, and then we see Simpell's in the audience too. Simpell's in the back here. I think this is Simpell here, but this is actually when he starts to get on the early boats coming out in 1917. This would have been early in his career, and Simpell works his way up to first mate and then becomes captain as well. And he actually becomes first mate on board this boat that's the Huron. The Huron actually starts off as the Huron, and it actually has a nice career on the Great Lakes. And then they sell off the whole fleet to go to the ocean. So as World War I starts up, they need colliers. They need vessels that can be converted to haul coal for the war effort. And so these guys were all going to come out and almost exclusively go into the Pennsylvania run and go into Boston. They were running a lot from Boston and coast to coast in that area, and left freshwater. He had to make some modifications, and here you see him again later in his career. This one was rebuilt, so as soon as they got it, they brought it to Noank, where they actually did a complete conversion. You can see how it has an open deck here, and that wasn't going to work on the ocean. They needed some more protection. So they bring it in, and they made, this is actually one of the sister boats. We don't have a picture of the Huron before it was lost, but they add on these protective weather covers that go across here. This is a painting they sent me from the yard, and these are very clearly Great Lakes vessels, so it's totally possible that when they painted this, one of these is actually the Huron that sat there. And the Huron, if you look at the headlines, as they started to convert it, was just absolutely cursed. So they get in, and it slips on the ways. They have a problem where a mast falls down and hurts one guy and kills another guy. And they go through this whole thing of how it's a hoodoo ship, that they can't wait to get rid of the Huron, even though it immediately goes into service and doesn't have any problems during World War I. And then it actually comes back to the Great Lakes with all these modifications. And this is where she ends her days up here in very thick fog. So it comes out of the Sioux Locks here, and it goes in, it's empty, and it's waiting to eventually go across and pick up an ore cargo when another vessel came down, the Cetus, which, if you know your Greek history, Cetus is the Greek sea monster, which is kind of bizarre. Very often we don't have a connection with the name of a ship that actually makes it scarier than it actually is. Somebody just did a whole story on the Great Lakes Triangle, and my friend Brendan Baylod was quoted in there. For all of us historians, you know, you've probably heard me, a lot of people, the ghosts and the gold stuff, they add that in to make it super, you know, interesting. I think there's 10,000 amazing stories on the Great Lakes. We don't need ghosts. We certainly don't need fake triangles and stuff. I get the need, and especially in the 1975, 76 region when the Bermuda Triangle book came out, everybody wanted a book. So when the Great Lakes Triangle book came out, I just laughed. You know, we have more vessels that are lost outside of that triangle, and especially aircraft and everything else. I would say that it's all kind of nonsense. But when we get these, we find this ship on the bottom. This is, see the little weather protection here that was added on there. It's going to be significant in our story. Many times we try to get our artists to put this together, and we actually were very lucky to get Bob McGreevy, who's probably the most, well, he is in my eyes, the greatest artist on the Great Lakes doing work like this. Ed Pusick used to do pencil sketches, but he could never paint the way that McGreevy has recreated. And I'll show you some other McGreevy paintings. I'm sure you'll agree. He sketched these pieces of the Cetus crashing into the vessel, and this is where the crash mark would be, right? So as soon as they got in there, they realized that all the guys jumped over here. These guys kept power on to keep the ship wedging that hole shut so that they weren't going to sink right away. And as soon as they got here, Simpell realized the dog wasn't there, and he says, "Where's the dog?" And he says he's tied up in the galley. So he jumps off. This vessel's slowly sinking because the water is gaining on it. He runs in through an open door here, goes into the galley, unties the dog and brings him out and gets on deck, and the ship goes down. And of course the headlines are all, you know, he saves a dog, and everybody managed to live up there. And sure enough, McGreevy paints a picture, or draws a picture of the dog being saved, which this is amazing, don't get me wrong. But I call up the museums and I start to say, hey, Dick Simpell was on 17 Shipwrecks. You guys must have heard of the family. And the lady sends me back a note. I know his widow. You know, know, and she goes, they've donated all these pictures. It's almost like the Larson collection when we met, and their whole family has all of these stories of these boats that, especially the last of the Skeel, an entire voyage of the ship. You know, these are the gems that come out of having incredible people in the audience that always bring a shoebox up to me and say, do you want to see this? And the answer, of course, is always yes. Yes, I want to see it. So the lady calls me up. She goes, let me send you some pictures. I think there's one of a dog. Here's him with the dog, but this is 2-3 years before the ship sank, and it's a different boat, but I'm going to go with this as the bulldog, right? They said it was a bulldog, and that's Dick Simpell holding the dog. I haven't even told Whitefish Point that I have this picture yet, so don't tell them. We're waiting for the book to come out, and then I'll fess up, because they'll go out and they'll do a bunch of lectures, and they'll steal my picture. And I said, no way will I. Oh, wait a minute, is this on video? No. Of course, we share with their new discovery that they just found, and we'll hear more about that in February. An incredible discovery off Whitefish Point. Immediately, I turn over all of my archives, and we try to make sure that these stories are told, and there's such great storytellers up there. Corey Adkins is a fantastic Emmy-winning documentary producer, so I always share all of my material, and I may give him this picture later on. So we hear about the shipwrecks of Simpell. He saves, the Huron goes down, he finds another gig. He actually goes in with the Paterson group, and he becomes the captain on board. Actually, he's not first mate on the Novadoc at first. He'll become captain later on. And sure enough, they sail in, and he gets one more shipwreck. So they run aground right on this reef that's called Imperial Island, and it's hanging up, as you can see in the picture. Novadoc is right on the cliff, so when the divers come in to try to salvage all of the wheat that was inside there, they actually had a drop off, and it was very dangerous. And all the newspapers, it talks about how, you know, deadly it was for them. They were worried the ship was going to slide off of there, but they recovered the Novadoc, and they actually brought her back in to sail again. And actually, through the Paterson line, that these, you know, crews would kind of move around. And sure enough, the captain that was on board the Novadoc here was actually on board the Huron with Simpell as well. So these captains, we see them move around even within shipping companies all around. And as I look at the listing of all the ships for Paterson, you'll notice something interesting about all the boats. Do you see the suffix on all of them as DOC, dock? So they have the Q dock, the Prin dock, the Porta dock. DOC stands for Dominion of Canada. So that was their way of taking the vessels and paying homage to basically the St. Lawrence here. You know, all of their provinces are all named as ships in here. Novadoc from Nova Scotia would be, you know, Nova Dock. So all of these boats, that's how they could tell their fleet, and we see that a lot. There were ships that were all named for poker cards. There were ships that were named, many of them would do the planets, Mercury and Saturn and stuff like that. So it was neat that people would kind of have that affinity to actually have rhyme or reason, other than just putting the rich people's names on the boats, which we see most of the time, right? So here's a Cartier dock. So he gets off of the Novadoc after that accident. He's the captain on board the Cartier dock, goes right past where they sank the Novadoc, and runs aground himself in September of 1940. So shipwreck number 3 of the supposed 17 times that he's been wrecked. And it goes through all these notes. This is his protest. This is for the insurance company of what actually happened, where he said, I had limited visibility. I didn't know where I was. It ran up on ground. But Paterson's deal was, and many shipping companies do this, if you run a ship aground, you can't be captain for at least a couple months. So you go busted down to first mate, and you run with another captain just until your probation period's over. So he gets down to be on the first mate on the Novadoc, and they change out captains, and they bring in another captain, and he runs into the Great Storm of 1940 and has another shipwreck. So here's Novadoc sitting off Pentwater with giant waves crashing over the bottom. A massive wave came over on November 11th and hit the galley, blew out the skylights, and the cooks were washed right away, and sadly they never found them again. I think they found one Slavin. I think they found one of the guys, but there's not a lot of writing on it. These guys up here actually stayed up inside the pilot house and built out of a bucket, took all the furniture, and built a fire right in the captain's bedroom and survived that. They barricaded the office door because the waves were crashing so hard. Sadly, these guys back here were in the oiler's room up to their knees. And the Coast Guard came out, couldn't find the beach, even though there were cars out here. The Coast Guard could not get to this beach, and it led to a lot of problems with why couldn't you save these guys. Now, there were other big issues happening during the storm. A massive car ferry went ashore in Ludington. That's where a lot of their attention went. They thought there was a lot of people on board there. They figured this was on the sandbar, they'd be okay. But meanwhile, for 2 nights, they sit out there waiting for someone to rescue them. And sadly, one of them almost freezing to death. This is the wheelsman on board the vessel that was in the forward section. And Lloyd told me that the storm was pretty incredible.
We knew there wasn't any lifeboats because they were broken. And one went floating right up past us. I was still in the wheelhouse when the starboard lifeboat let go, and it went right up alongside of us. So I thought, oh, it wouldn't be any good to us anyway, so we'd never get back there. And they didn't have floats or anything for in the bow end.
No raft or anything in the
no,
front?
Wow. No.
What time did you hit? At what time of night was it when you guys went below?
Oh, 11 o'clock at night on November the 11th. And that's when we hit, and then we sat there all the next day, and then we were rescued 36 hours afterwards. So he sat there in the pilot house waving bed sheets out, going, why aren't you guys trying to save us? What's going on? And meanwhile, a fisherman went to the Coast Guard and said, I can run out there and grab them if you want. And they said, mind your own business. We're the Coast Guard. We'll take care of this. And so they go back, and the next day they don't get rescued. And Simpell, who's on the right-hand side here, his face all cut up from when the wave hit the pilot house. It's a flat pilot house in the front, and it just broke all the glass out and cut his face. He goes, I'm going to swim for it. And they said, no, you're not going to swim for it. And that's when he told the crew, he'd been on at least 15 shipwrecks is what he told them at that time. So the captain told him, no, you're not swimming there. You're going to wait. And the story goes that everybody moved forward here. Now, we don't know for sure because as time went on, the newspaper said everybody went forward. But the guys in the back, one of the oilers actually told me, no, we stayed back there and were rescued. So I think his mind, after a while, lost the story. But it was pretty incredible where he said that finally the fishermen came out, brought them ashore, and saved their lives. And it's a great part of my book. If you will read The Wheelsman, which we have copies here, my documentary, Safe Ashore, goes into that as well. And a big podcast, too. If you want to watch that for free, I'll give you an address. You can listen to all the guys talking about it. So Simpell gets back to captain, gets aboard the Sorel dock, and spends a lot of his time going to Michigan ports with newspaper print. So we're now seeing all this pulpwood being converted into newspapers, and one of his big customers was the Chicago Trib. So the Trib, when Santa's going to come and Bob Hope is going to come, says, well, we need a ship, and we'll make the Sorel dock become Santa, the SS Santa Claus, and that way Simpell would become the captain, right? So this is actually him pulling into Chicago on board the Sorel dock. Here's all the people at the Trib, where they normally would bring the newspaper rolls in here, but there's over 1 million kids over here ready to see Santa Claus. And some of the early dignitaries from a local TV show were on board too. But Bob Hope was the big draw, and in they came. So this was his big deal, especially in 1949. And then sadly, with the career that he had, his brother had a heart attack on a ship and died. And it happens again to Simpell himself. So he pulls into Milwaukee, same ship, has a heart attack, and they have to lower him down in his chair and bring him ashore. And it turns out that they had another guy that was already sick, so they had to wait for another captain to come in to bring the boat back. He would actually go home and respite and live a couple more years, but didn't sail anymore after that. And then the captain that takes over after him goes to the same area and is found dead in his room too from a heart attack. So crazy, these lines that we get. You don't need ghost stories to back up that stuff at all. So we figure we've kind of heard the last of Simpell's shipwrecks, right? I haven't been able to connect where he got 17. I know of 5, but the other ones I don't know where they were, if they were early in his career, if it might have been even some wartime stuff. And sadly, because he's gone now and his family's gone, those records are pretty much gone. So we're out looking for shipwrecks as we go in further out from this one, actually very close to where the Edmund Fitzgerald went down. So there's a line of U.S. and Canadian water. The Fitzgerald's right on that line.
This one's just inside the U.S. waters, and as we went through, we saw it was a steel vessel, and there's only 2 big ones this size that were up there. So we started guessing on what it would be, and Huron was definitely one of the ones that we figured. So Daryl Ortel, who captains the boat and also runs the ROV, runs down. Bruce Lynn is our director, so he's in charge of much of the history that comes out and also taking care of all of our properties. And sure enough, we dropped the ROV down, and as we go up, we can actually go into the engine room and look down. We're going into now the dining area, so you're looking down at the fancy area where the officers could actually eat. It's all wood trimmed inside. You can see the panels that are there. And as we go around too, it's interesting to have structure like this. Normally, the air pressure when a ship goes down, it blows all of these cabins and especially any of the top superstructure away. And especially the wooden stuff. Look at now as we go down here, we can instantly see the doors are open. This will be looking onto the starboard side, so we know that this is actually, you know, where the collision should be. And as we go around, actually, let me think, it's pointing this way. So stern's this way, so this would be the port side. And we go along and we can see the electrical lights, so that rules out one of the ships. We know it's the Huron at this point. And as we go through, we can see the weather deck that they actually added on. So all of that stuff that was put on at the shipyard in Connecticut is all very evident there. And as you go forward of that, here's where the Cetus crashed into it. This ship did not have a chance to survive. Once the Cetus pulled away, all of that Lake Superior water poured into it, and it went down like a stone. So you see how massively, you know, the collision is. Even though the ship was empty, it's just all torn up, even to the hatches that are right there. So we instantly knew that this was the vessel, and it was very interesting for me. Having done all those interviews about Simpell 25 years earlier, to connect all these things together for me was pretty significant. And certainly a neat chapter to the story that many times we'll see a name and say we'll never see a photograph of that person, much less get 20 photographs from the family of him with his wife and him with the dog and all these other things. He was a big deal in Midland, Ontario for sure. A lot of ship stories for a guy that was on 17 shipwrecks, right? Here's Tony the Bulldog, and of course I had to have AI create this for me because I have no pictures of Tony. Tony is the greatest shipwreck survivor because he almost became dinner. It turns out when you get shipwrecked and all you have left are cans of tomatoes and that's it, and everybody's looking around for a meal, and there's Tony going, hey, how's it going? So the Waldo runs aground in the big storm of 1913. November 10th, the captain loses steerage and he tries to get it around the Keweenaw Peninsula and sadly runs aground, and of course there's no one there to see him until finally another ship goes by and actually gets close enough to shore and sends somebody in to contact the lifesavers and says, you've got to go get these guys. It was captained by Duddleson. This ship was actually built in Bay City. This was the LC Waldo, and we see it here in the dry dock, and if you look, it's not elevated on blocks. It fell off the blocks. Its bottom, once it was salvaged, was filled with concrete to try to get it to float again, to try to make it watertight, and it fell off the blocks there. So what a bear that must have been to jack it back up inside the actual slip to do it. Here's where they actually ran aground. Here's the first team that went out. They came out of Eagle River, and as they got out here, their big boat, the motorized boat, wouldn't start. So all in the logbook, you see them kind of saying, hey, we're just going to go and try to take the smaller boat out. And they made it about this far and realized, no, we're icing up, we're frozen. They got them back to the Eagle River and they had to chip them out of the boat. So here they are completely frozen up. And down here is where Portage takes off and luckily gets a tugboat, the Hebert, that takes them out and runs all the way through here. Imagine these guys start to lose, leave out of port right there. Imagine what the locals were saying. And I got to have a good Youper tell you the story of what the locals were saying as they watched this lifeboat the first time go out.
They were in the lighthouse, this family with the lightkeeper, and they said, better wire Washington, boys. Those guys ain't never coming back, because they saw them go out. Well, they got out of here and made it about almost to Copper Harbor, but Tucker was afraid because of the ice buildup in that, and they had a hard time. I don't know, they said I read an excerpt that they had a hard time keeping the engine going. He was afraid for his crew, so he turned around and came back. And then they said when they made it to shore, the townspeople had to break the ice off their jackets and stuff to get them, and I believe, it happened with maybe a Tucker and Glaze, a boat. They had to break the ice off his hands from the steering wheel.
They finally get the other motor going, and they run out. In fact, if we look at the boat right here, these guys take off, the Hebird picks them up. And by the way, the Hebird steam engine still exists. It's actually at Ford's collection of steam engines. If you've ever been in the big museum at Henry Ford, sadly it's not on display anymore, and they put it in storage waiting. I said, hey, can I get pictures of it during COVID? And they're like, no, you can't come in here, you know, COVID this, COVID that. Now they won't let me in there. I'd love to go see it just to say, hey, it's a significant motor that actually brought these guys out. But they got here ahead of this team and waited till daybreak because it was a popsicle. It was frozen solid and they couldn't get in there. So they waited for this other team that got the other boat running and ran all the way out and met them at about the same time. And when they got on board, they chopped their way in here, and here's these people all huddled around in this room. In fact, they went forward to the windlass room up here where the actual chain is to bring up, and the winching system to bring up the anchors. They were all huddled up in front there, and here's this dog going, thank God you're here, you know, because they were seriously looking at Tony. They brought him out. Everybody got to shore. 3 ladies were on board. Full crews were on board, and it was amazing because when they did the medals 2 years later, they gave out 23 gold medals for life-saving for the entire country. 17 of those medals went to these crews for this incredible rescue. And Glaze was one of the guys that was really a big deal in this, not only for his life-saving here, but this guy brought a camera out and took pictures. So all the shipwreck pictures you see from 1913 from the city of Bangor, where the ships that were on a Bay City built ship that ran into the Keweenaw in 23, but loaded with cars, all of that material was taken by him. So he's snapping these pictures. Then his career gets bigger because when the Coast Guard comes in, he becomes the commandant of all the Great Lakes. So what an amazing career for this guy. And all these pictures are all taken by him. And you almost wonder, here's Glaze right there. All this stuff is probably written by him as well. So they managed to bring this vessel back up. It sailed forever. It had several different names. The last name on the lakes was the Mohawk Deer. They said, we're going to scrap it, but they couldn't get a good price here. So they said, well, let's send it to Italy and we'll get a good deal there. And they went all the way across the ocean, and another storm came up and sank the vessel down, which is incredible. So now a ship built in Bay City is in the Mediterranean, which is hard to believe. Here's the Medal of Honor. You see the recipients, especially our guys, Charles Tucker, who's the keeper, McCormick, the other keeper, all getting awards. And here's what the vessel looks like on the bottom of the Mediterranean. And I'm saving up my pop cans to go. I cannot wait to go dive this, especially in Portofino, because this is at the very top of the boot. It would be amazing to go there and see this for sure. Here's another boat. I wish this was the outcome for this amazing collie, but sadly, there was no room in the lifeboat for this guy during the big storm. It turns out, too, that we lost 2 guys from Bay City in this big storm. This was Black Friday of October of 1916. And one of the kids didn't want to go sailing, but his uncle said, listen, on the Filer, we got room. I'll give you a big bonus if you come along. And sadly, he drowns, but the captain's the only survivor. You know, you hear in these storms of the captain, you know, bravely going down with a ship like Titanic. In the storm of 1916, 3 captains came back when the crews didn't come back. So it's an incredible story of how, and that was just the survival on a life raft. It's not like they did anything nefarious or anything, but at one point they had many people that were going to be saved, but they could only outlive that. Here's the Marshall Butters. This is a beautiful picture actually from one of our collectors in this area too, Ralph Roberts, who has a beautiful collection of boats. And it's one of the little lumber hookers, and you can tell it doesn't carry a lot, but they would carry a lot of lumber back and forth, and that's what it was basically doing. Now, when all of our trees were cut in Michigan, they went to Canada, and that's where they started finding trees until the Canadians caught on to us, and they're like, hey, couldn't you use our sawmills here instead of Bay Cities? And they're like, yeah, I guess we could, and they raised the tariffs up to even things out. You know, and we can't blame them. We've done the same thing to them. President McKinley definitely chased a lot of people out of our salt business and such as well. But this is where they left from, so they're taking the Marshall Butters, which is named for big lumber dealer, big Upper Peninsula outfit too as well, and a major dealer out of Ludington. We see them go out here, they go through the river system, they get out here, and this is when the storm hit. Just off of the island system there by Peely Island, and the ship starts to sink. So the water's coming on board, the captain says, you guys got to dump whatever you can into the lake. And truthfully, we never ever, and the reason we have people like Bob McGreevy paint these incredible pictures is because we never get photographs, right? Well, what do you think about the engineer jumping off his sinking boat, but he had a camera and brought it with him and starts snapping pictures of the boat actually going down? This picture was probably lost for the last, I'd say 70 years, 80 years, until I saw it in a collection. I went, wait a minute, that looks really familiar. This is from the Schmock collection. They attributed it to one of the crewmen on board the Billings in one of the early newspapers, and that's what threw a lot of us off. So we didn't know it existed, but the collection was Schmock's picture, and it had all these other pictures that clearly were from his camera. So we know this one, which we've seen in the newspaper. Look at the lumber all here, and the Billings goes around them and starts throwing oil overboard. Back then, of course, it's a horrible pollution thing now, but they figured that if you could put oil on the water, it would calm the waters enough to be saved. And they believed this worked, that they dumped it in. These guys were going into their lifeboats. 2 different freighters were there. They managed to get everybody off, but sadly the dog was left behind and had to go down with the vessel. And this is pretty much all that's really down there. It's a shallow enough wreck, and when I dove it, it's like diving pea soup. So you go in there and you get down and you almost hit the wreck and you go, oh my God, there's a big piece of steel in my face, and you realize that's the engine. And then you go along the side and there's places where you can tell where the hawser was, where the chains came through. Obviously, when you see any kind of pieces of plates or anything from the galley, you instantly know that this was a place where people lived and obviously worked. Luckily, most people don't steal these things anymore. Back in the 50s and 60s, divers, they would take this immediately as a treasure of the deep. Now we realize that this stuff is much more valuable on the bottom. Also, some divers like to take and move it to a place where all the divers can see it. I think that's wonderful in your head, but in a new shipwreck, never, ever, ever touch anything on the bottom. That's where it was left, and in many cases, if the captain put his binoculars down there, that's part of the story. So we don't like to touch or move anything on shipwrecks. This, of course, through salvage and everything else, there's certainly a lot that has been taken. Here's the triple expansion steam engine rising up from the bottom. Not too far from the surface too, but deep enough that it's not a hazard. Normally the Army Corps would go in and blow up anything less than 25 feet from the surface, and that's how we lost a lot of our shipwrecks. Remember, Lake Erie is only 70 feet deep at its average, so when many of these ships sink, the mast still stuck above the water. And there's several stories of the guys would crawl up and never get wet during the shipwreck, and they'd come and pick them up. In fact, the filer, the story where the boy from Bay City was lost, he hung in there as these guys are falling out of the rafters. They're frozen, waiting for help to come. And when finally a passenger ship comes by, he finally goes into the drink and they grab him, but the other guy they couldn't find. And you see the zebra mussels coating anything. These winches, you can actually go around and see some of the windings that are there. Some of the machinery too is all just covered in these zebra mussels. Another incredible photo. We've got shipwreck sinking. We've got dogs are left over. This is an actual rescue picture. So this is the Westcott, if you know the mail boat that's downtown in Detroit. This is one of the early boats from there. The Westcott tug was working the UP, towing the guys in from Grand Marais. So this is loaded with all of the survivors of the Parker, the AA Parker. And 2 dogs are on board there, and I have to write sport and he who shall not be named because there was a black dog on board and they did not have a nice name for that black dog. They used a very derogative term that we don't use anymore, and it pains me not to be factual in my book, but I think we'll just leave that to the imagination of what they called that dog. But here they are coming in, all of the crew, and everybody was saved, which was amazing. The weird thing about these stories about the dogs is some of these logbooks go down to, hey, they took 2 pairs of socks from us and this and that. And there's not a mention of those dogs in any of the logbooks. And you'd think that they'd write something down. And this is not uncommon. There's some guys that would write in the logbooks. I think they were very frustrated authors, and they would come up and they'd write, the monstrous, fingery, foamy fingers, came up and grabbed. And you're like, man, dude, you had a lot of time on your hands to write these stories. And some of them just write 5 people rescued, boat likely Parker. That's what we get out of it. So some of it's very good. Some of it's really, really lame. This history actually in the book goes more back into who A.A. Parker was. And this guy was a bigwig, as you can tell. He was very tall. This is a cartoon that they drew of him. Aaron Parker came into town and worked for his uncle for a while and got into the shipping business. So when you hear about famous boats like the Tajmu and the White Star Line, which has no connection to the White Star from Titanic, this is the Big Island. So these guys knew that there was money if they could open up their own little park where people could get away from the city. And they bought this on Harson's Island. You might have heard they just ran out of water. Something happened to their water main line a month ago. This is Harson's Island that's in the river system there. The Tajmu being a very famous pleasure boat that came in, he was pretty much the big chief on that. So they hear about this boat that actually has a collision with another passenger vessel in the river, and it goes down, and Falcon comes in and brings it up. You can see the barrels he used to raise this up. In 1891, they get it for a song, and he says, well, now we put so much money into this, you should let us rename it into my name, because normally the government would say, it's too much paperwork to put a new name on there. Let's just call it the old name. And they said, no, this is not that boat anymore. The Kasota no longer exists. The Parker is now its name, and so they gave it the name A.A. Parker, and it had a really good career. Look at that hole. That's from the collision. The cook was the only person that couldn't get off in time. Unfortunately, she was below decks and everybody else managed to get out. And sadly, this thing went down and another ship ran into it, tore off a lot of the top of the vessel as well. But this was towed right into Detroit dry dock, so right downtown Detroit. They did some work on it. Through many of the strikes, it took forever for them to get it out of the dry docks. They almost launched it prematurely. We're going to take it over to Port Huron to get it finished and go around the Union that was here. But the carpenters finally relented and got it fixed up and brought it out. Another story that we don't hear about is a woman that was rescued on board. There are many times the Coast Guard will say, 19 men, 1 woman. At least give us a breakdown of what happened. But Fred and Haley Wise were on board this vessel. And this is very weird for me to see this name because our son, his girlfriend is actually, the dad is Fred Wise. So this is the first time that I've actually seen that. But mom's name isn't Haley. So Ruby was never on a shipwreck either. So this is good. But these two survived this. And then the tragedy comes up as you look through all the notes. This is the actual logbook where they talk about what happened. And again, it's one of the real simple. We rowed a long distance. We picked them up and we brought them back. And then the tugboats brought us in. So they name the tugboats. They don't talk anything about Fred and Haley Wise. But if you do a Google search for both of them, they get onto another boat and sadly it's lost. In 1911, it goes down and the cooks and one of the mates are the only people that are lost on this vessel. And it's relatively tragic. I mean, it's completely tragic that it was Thanksgiving and the family were all writing letters back and forth. Can't wait to see you. And it goes down and these people both, he had just canceled his insurance too on the ship. And of course, there's a big story about that as well. But yeah, both the cooks that survived the Parker get on board this vessel in Lake Erie and it's lost sadly. And this is one of those cool photo mosaics where photographers will go down and take pictures and they glue it together in 3D, which I'll show you in a minute. Parker was found, Whitefish Point found this many years ago, and they really didn't do much with it. We had a transition in leadership and went to a new director, and finally the mandate was, let's do a story on the Parker, and they didn't do anything on the early part of it, so I'm so glad that this chapter is now more complete that's in the book. My argument for my wife is, you don't have a lot about a dog in that chapter, and I'm like, yeah, but the other history is really cool, and I think I'm really guilty of going way overboard, trying to fill in details that I think are super interesting. Here's one of the stories that I don't think is true. This is Ruff, and when the Chicora went down, this is one of the most sought after boats on Lake Michigan. They thought they found it, and they said this little trace that we see on this sonar is the boat, and the guy said, if you pay me, I'll give you the coordinates, and nobody was going to give them any money for it. So it's remained that way now for almost 8 years of trying to figure out if it is the Chicora. It's in the relative area, so it's possible, and there's many other of us that are kind of searching the area anyways and saying, well, we'll just find it again anyway. So the boat was never found. They had a message that came in a bottle in the book here, Bottled Goodbyes that I wrote, has a chapter on this. I did not know about Ruff though, because it turns out that a little doggy actually washes ashore after this shipwreck, and all these people start to embrace this story with, oh my God, I can't believe somebody made it, this little tiny puppy that's here. And as you go through, it talks about where the dog was from. It says that Ruff was actually a dog that hung around the docks and jumped on board, and then he was found at a hotel, and they gave out the guy's name and everything, and you read the newspaper and say, oh, that's great, but then there's one tiny newspaper that comes out with a letter from the hotel owner, and he says, yeah, that's all BS. That's not true. Nothing in there. If you look, Chikora's dog is alive, and it goes through a whole story of how they found it and at Potawatomi Park and where it was all located. And you go over here and you start reading, Mute Messenger arrives, and you go, oh, that seems really legit. And I even looked up on the map where Solon's property was. It was really close to the railroad tracks. Looked like a great story for sure. And then here's the note from Solon. From the park, I received a dispatch today from Cole and Middleton of Chicago. These guys had those dime museums in Chicago where you would pay to see the horned lady, or you would pay to see, you know, the flying dogs or whatever. They wanted this shipwreck dog in a bad way. They're like, we want it. So they call the hotel and say, give us that. So I go do a whole chapter on Middleton as well. It says, we received it. I wish to say there was no dog that came to my place as reported. I knew nothing of the story until I learned about what was in the newspaper. Someone must have a very vivid imagination, and I regret very much that no one would wish to distort the truth. So it probably didn't happen. And of course, you don't see any other reports about the Wonder Dog, and I certainly didn't see a big newspaper ad with, you know, Ruff the Wonder Dog. So one of the guys finally fessed up that this is a dog that's been around the docks forever, and Ruff was just a scrounger and never went on board the ship. So whether or not it's true, you can keep that in your mind. Another one that's kind of been really printed in almost every book, the SR Kirby was pretty much a mystery ship until they just found it within 5 years ago. And it's a composite vessel, meaning it's part steel, part wood, so it was a revolutionary new design. Kirby, being a very famous designer that came to Bay City, worked Saginaw, finally ended up going to Detroit, where his dad actually did more work, or actually the son was here. No, the dad was here, the son went to Detroit and had an incredible career. Frank Kirby, a big designer. Here's the wreck report. You go through, there's nothing about a dog being found, but all the history pieces talk about 2 survivors that come in, and then a dog comes in on the wreckage. And then they found one body that supposedly came up that the lifesavers found. So I go to Chicago, I go through every logbook of all of the keepers that are in that area. Every page, there's not a single note about a dog being found. And in fact, in one of the books reads that the dog stayed for the entire winter at the station. Now, trust me, these guys were pretty much military guys. I mean, they weren't a branch of the military, but it was pretty regimented. They would have said, P.S. you owe me for this food for this dog. You know, I mean, I think there would have been at least one note in the entire book of a winter, you know, where these guys actually lived. The keepers stayed in the post in up in the Keweenaw. So you go through the whole report. It talks about finding the one crew member who passed away, even the little tiny island where he was found, all kinds of details on that. The story of Murda and the story of Lindquist, their survivals being picked up by these other boats. Nothing is in the logbook because they jump aboard the Utley and the Hartwell, and then there's no report. So there's nothing really good detail in that at all, except for the newspapers that give us a big story about how Lindquist saw the dog floating and he went under the water and was drowned. So where it came from, I don't know. But again, it's in most books. There's also a story that comes out that James True survives. And you look at it and you go, how did they get this picture? And why is he wearing a shirt that says American? Well, this guy was on a shipwreck before in World War I, and the Germans torpedoed him. In fact, this is before we lost and really entered the war. So as you look at the major things that happened before World War I, this was a big deal that they sank a ship that had Americans on board, and there were big headlines about why it happened and who it happened to, and he survived it. Well, then he shows up and tells everybody, I was on board the Kirby, and it turns out nobody knew he was there. I don't think he was on board that vessel, as a matter of fact, as we look at all of it. So where did the Mascot story come from? They even named him. They named him Tige, and all the stories go through, and I'm like, this name looks weird, Tige, in all of the headlines. And then if you Google search Tige, you realize it's Buster Brown's dog. So Is it possible someone named their dog after Buster Brown? Of course. You know, I mean, how many Snoopies do you think there are out in the world? I don't know if he winked nearly as much as this dog obviously did, but I don't think that tag existed. I think the Coast Guard would have at least, or the lifesavers would at least wrote, hey, by the way, we picked up a dog and he's going to stay with us. There's no report of them shipping him back to Detroit where the widow of Girardin was actually at. So I don't know, you know, where that went to, but the log books are always super fun to read through, and much of the stuff I have online, and when you go through and you read especially about Douglas, who was the guy sadly that was found on the island. So when the guys go down, Eliason is searching, Whitefish Point is searching. They found it within the same week. And when they get over the target, no wonder people missed it. It's super deep. It's like 800 feet deep. And this is the major pieces of it. So it's blown to smithereens. And nobody can really figure out why that happened. It didn't collide with anything. It just sank and went down. Until I started looking at the blueprints. The blueprints, the revolutionary design of the Kirby was to have ballast tanks high instead of low. So these areas right here were tanks that they'd actually fill with water when they didn't have cargo, and it would lower them down in so the propeller would work more efficiently. Well, when these things are empty and it goes below, they pretty much become just encapsulated bombs and blew the ship apart. So it's probably more likely when it went down, if these hatches stayed on, and especially these are sealed areas with the vents on them, that would easily destroy it. And look at, this is a sonar of what it should look like. That's just a piece, you know, that's probably not even 40 feet long of this vessel. And of course, Eliason, you could see actually some of the wood where it actually met into the iron. So a lot to be discovered still here as well, but you don't spend a lot of time when you don't have anything really visual there at all. Another McGreevy painting. This is pretty incredible. As you look at the color detail that he does, he realizes what color greens they should be. I mean, he goes down to even counting the rivets on ships to make sure that his detail is close. This is a story of two vessels that are up in thick fog. They're going around Michigan's Thumb, and as they go through, here's a beautiful view, and you can even see the Port Austin light. Actually, it's Point Au Barque lighthouse right there, and you see basically they're on a collision course as they come in, and the Albany is put to blame, but truthfully, they both had lanes that they should have been in, and they didn't know exactly where they were. This is the Saginaw newspaper, and this is the only mention that I heard. And it says there were two dogs belonging to the captain and engineer of the Philadelphia, which had been left behind. Now, what happened is the Albany gets abandoned, so they all run over to the Philadelphia and cut their lifeboats loose. The Philadelphia is sailing along, towing the Albany to shallow water, and all of a sudden they realize the Albany is going loose, so they cut it loose and it sinks. And then they realize the Philadelphia is sinking, and all those lifeboats are back here. All the life belts, everything. So half of them don't have boats or life belts, and the Philadelphia is going along and they're lowering their boats trying to get them out. Two boats are launched. One is found upside down, everybody's gone, and it's all, the people that are on board are all bashed up, like they think it went through the propeller, that the Philadelphia was set on a course to hopefully hit shore or get shallow enough that they could salvage it. Captain just left it steaming, and sadly they get in, and of course the guys at Point Au Barques are having this cruise just arrive on their doorstep, and they have to figure out what to do. Big inquiry in Tawas. The guys don't want to talk about who collided into who. It's a big mystery, but we know that the dogs were left. And we look at this. This is the Albany. Look at the damage to this thing. This was loaded full of flour, and the story goes that for 90 years, bags of flour were still washing ashore in Canada, and they would just take the outer coating off of it, and that the inside flour was still able. Now, I've read about this happening. I've never seen it in the newspaper, so again, I don't know, is it true? But it was certainly loaded full of flour. And the backstory of this actually sinking with flour in the Straits some months before, pretty incredible as well. Philadelphia was fully loaded with all kinds of equipment, including cook stoves. So as you go on deck, you can see these. They're coated with zebra mussels, but these are the cook stoves that are on deck, and it's much better intact. As a matter of fact, it's a lot more to enjoy, and the propeller is massive. I've been down there. Here's the Dean Richmond. This is against the elevators. This was famous as being one of the major treasure ships on the Great Lakes. Everybody thought it had silver ore or zinc on board. Zinc didn't really have a lot of value. It's great, you know, as you use it for trying to make aluminum. You're trying to make rust-proofing stuff as well. There wasn't much other call for it, so I don't know why it was so sought after. But when it went down, everybody was searching for it forever. And the story, if you look into it, has a guy that comes ashore and says, I'm offshore, my dog is tied to the boat, I need help, somebody help me. And so they follow him out, and some boats say that there was a dog there, some say they never even found the boat. But I believe the boat was ashore, we saw enough of that. But this guy didn't exist on the boat. So it's another guy that probably went around to the newspapers and said, yeah, hey, I was on this ship, a lot like James True, and he never was really on board there. So all these stories go about the dog and everything. It's all pretty much fake news. And it's interesting that when they finally find the ship, they have Cherokee ingots. So this is coming out of Kansas from the Cherokee plant of all these ingots. And as they bring them up, illegally at the time, they just brought them up and said, we'll figure out, you know, if it's wrong or not afterwards. They were valueless, and they turned it out, bringing these to Canada, and made doorsteps at a motel out of it. So that's what they ended up doing with it. No treasure. They destroyed part of the shipwreck. In fact, if we take a look, let's put this in 3D and show you a shipwreck. You can see it's upside down, and it's one of our rare twin propellered shipwrecks. But look at the propeller. Actually on the starboard side is missing. So that was cut off and salvaged. I have never seen a record of where that went, but it's totally possible that the crew that came out to look for ingots might have found some value in a propeller. A lot of that stuff was brought up too. People would bring it to the parks, give windlasses and stuff to the city. And of course, if it's made out of wood, it just rots away. It's no real value. It should go to a museum to be preserved if that's what's going to happen. I'll leave you with this. As I did the Edmund Fitzgerald story, I had heard a story from the captain on board the Coast Guard cutter Woodrush. He said it was the dog came along with them on this trip, and I kind of went, oh, that's interesting, but I just dropped it at that. I didn't have a book to write about it. So as I start to ask the different crew members about Sugi, who's named for a cleanser that's actually used for greasy compounds on the ship. So a Sugi is a mix of material that they'd actually put down to dissolve the heavier oils, and Sugi was named for this. So he's a black lab that was on board the Woodrush. They said he could drink his fill. They would bring in a ashtray, and he would drink beer out of the ashtray to the thrill of everybody at the bars in Duluth where they had the Woodrush was actually docked. He was there, of course, when the ship responded to the Edmund Fitzgerald in 1975. We see him on deck here in this picture, laying down up there. So that's Sugi right there. We see him wearing headsets right here. So apparently he was radio dog first class on board the boat, and these guys were so nice to share the pictures that we have of Sugi. And the story goes that he would ride along on their adventures, but was not allowed up in the pilot house, the bridge as they call it for the military vessels, as they took off. Interrupted their football game. Of course, the Vikings were playing, and they had to hop on board and lose total reception and never knew what happened till they came all the way out here to search for the Edmund Fitzgerald. Jimmy Hobaugh was the captain. Did anybody ever see Jimmy when I brought him to Bay City? Yeah, a fantastic lecture. It was the last lecture that Jimmy did. Sadly, he got cancer, and only because he was a Mason did he come back here to do the story at the Masonic Temple. So it was very amazing to go to that building, first of all, and to have him there to do the talk. I just felt in awe just to stand there, but it was nice to share what I knew too. This is Jimmy as he was controlling the Valley Camp. He became the manager up there, talking about Sugi and what happened when they anchored and a big storm hit them and sank two of the floats that are still at Valley Camp. But then something very strange happened.
When I went out in April, no, they weren't anywhere close. And it was just one night. It was like you anchored over my ship and I'm going to slap you. Because for the next 10 days, it was just like a mirror, just like glass, perfectly calm. And it was so calm that you know, we had our dog on board. The dog didn't bark. People, it was like everything was muffled at night, even the generators running. Just an eerie feeling. It was a very, you can get emotional about it, you know, and you can get, if you believe in ghosts and so forth, you can imagine that.
Great interview, great story about Sugi. And of course, as you know, they go out with sonar, and this guy points to it and he says, these pieces are all up, right side up on the bottom. And his underling looks and he goes, Bob, that's upside down. I can see the propeller. And he looks at him and goes, listen, I'm the boss, right? As soon as you get the training that I get, you'll learn. So they go down and they dive the curve 3, and of course it's upside down. And so all the newspapers print that Bob had egg on his face because he had said this in front of all the reporters. And of course the hatch theories and stuff. This is the 50th anniversary of the Edmund Fitzgerald going down, so there's a lot of attention. I've already been booked for Duluth. I'm lucky enough to go to Manitowoc this year at the Ghost Ships Festival. A lot of people have an interest in the Edmund Fitzgerald, and it's wonderful to share that chapter, and especially my dive in '94 where we discovered much of the collapsed first hatch, the hatches at 5 and 6. I discovered more that there's no cargo in the front section of this, which is leading a lot of these experts that said it sank in one piece to go, wait a minute, I think it folded up on the surface. But we won't know until we go back and figure out where this cargo, 26,000 tons of iron ore, has spilled out on the bottom. It's not in any of these hatches because a submarine actually before us, the Clelia, went down in hatch 2. This one has a hatch that goes 12 feet into it, and then they go around to hatch 8, which is where it's cut off, broken from the midsection that's destroyed. And look at, there's no taconite here, there's no taconite around hatch H. Hatches 1 and 2, which are right here and back, or 2 and 3, forgive me, back aft of this, are actually at the back section of the ship. So when it sank, it did not sink in one piece. It broke on the surface, and those hatch clamps blew off when this scooted forward. And there's just so much more to be found down here. We're hoping that someday we'll be able to go back, but there's still some resistance. This is a grave site. It deserves all of our respect, but to me, the greatest respect is to find out what happened and to go down there and to tell the complete story of what actually happened down there. Delta dropping the plaque on the Edmund Fitzgerald, which that plaque actually has a list of all the people who were lost. This is before the bell was raised up, so we put a plaque down there with all those names, and of course my name's on there with the expedition crew. So 550 feet down below, we're honoring the men, but respecting the fact that we definitely did a pretty good job out there. This is what I'm working on now. I wanted to show you one more dog picture. This is a Nike missile. We had 18 of these bases that guarded Detroit, and as I look at it, it wasn't really guarding much of Ford or downtown. It was actually looking at a tank plant that was in Livonia and a couple other areas. But these missiles all surrounded the area, and the missile bases are now pretty much gone. There's one that might have a radio tower and stuff, but they were guarded by dogs, and that's interesting because the park that's next to our house within 15 minutes in Wixom is going to become a dog park. So that's kind of cool that they're repurposing when they used to have German Shepherds that you did not want to meet because these missiles were a big deal. But this is where all of them are located, and I'm doing a whole thing on the Bomarks too. So there'll be an entire lecture series, hopefully we'll be able to bring here, that'll talk more about that Air Force component, the Army component of the Nikes and stuff, which has always been fascinating. It's a Cold War chapter that I don't think has been written before. There's the base as it's laid out. That's where I stood as we did. The whole dog park will be right here now. So it'll be pretty incredible. This is where you can go for any more information you'd like to learn about my podcast. And of course, I take any questions that you might have about doggies or ships or shipwrecks or anything else that's going on. Grandkid updates, you name it. Any questions at all?
Sugi is pronounced Sugi.
Sugi, thank you. Thank you.
Personally used, I built it.
No kidding. Was there an actual bottle? Because they told me. Okay. But they didn't have an actual brand that was called Sugi? That's awesome. Thank you. Yeah. They told me it was written on a thing, but probably as a direction, right? Sugi. I like it. Thank you. I use the French pronunciation. Another question? Yes.
Early on, credit for one of the photos was for Huron Museum.
Yeah.
Where is that?
Oh, the Huron Museum is actually up in Georgian Bay. So as you go to Midland, they've got an amazing collection up there and a fantastic museum as well. So yeah, it's a great little area. Georgian Bay is a beautiful place to explore. Then they've got obviously a great collection of all of the early Paterson boats too, because a lot of the captains were from that Georgian Bay, Midland, an area around there as well.
Is that where they have the old cruise boat?
Yeah, the Chichiman, the big one, or which one?
The big one.
Yeah, the Chichiman comes out of, in fact, I just saw it this summer during my cruise. When you go up to Tobermory, the Chichiman leaves from there to Manitoulin, and they make back and forth trips with vehicles. So if you ever want to go up, it's a neat way to cut across and go to the Sioux that back way and enjoy Georgian Bay, which is amazing. And a cool museum too in Tobermory, and lots of neat shipwrecks. You can glide right over one in a glass bottom boat, just like our wreck in Munising that's from Bay City, as a matter of fact. You get to see one in Munising, and Sheboygan, Michigan has a glass bottom boat you can visit too. Any other questions? Yeah.
So the theory that the Fitz broke up on its surface, does that change the theory of the hatch covers? That it was crashing the boat that blew open the hatch covers rather than not being sealed?
The question is, does it change the theory as we talk about it breaking up on the surface? Did the hatch covers still have it? Most people have kind of discounted the hatch covers as being like the main theory. I've always said that the hatch covers never helped, that as the waves were coming in, it was leaking, and as they did calculations, the Coast Guard, especially the engineer that was there, Loosemore, came up with theories on how much water would have sank the ship, and that wasn't even including the 2 vents, at least 2. We don't know how many vents were missing. These are 8-inch openings in the deck of the Fitzgerald, so it's leaking through these gaskets in 21 of the hatch covers. Water's coming in there. No doubt that was happening. No doubt that they weren't all dogged down too. I mean, we could tell by the way they were locked in. Also, every picture I've ever seen on the Fitzgerald has hatch clamps off. So when people tell me they would never go into a storm, it's like, they believe that they were a lot heavier than that. And I'm not putting blame on the deckhands. This goes right to the captain. That captain did not want any overtime. And he told the cook, no overtime in the kitchen, no overtime on the deck. And so when they left on Sunday, they just ordered the mate just said, put the corners on and let's go. And that's, 2 captains on board the Fitzgerald. McCarthy, the mate, was a captain, and so was McSorley. So there's a lot of decisions and a lot of cutbacks, but that water coming in, the water coming in the vent, and then the big wave that came up and pushed it under, it just couldn't survive. It had too much water. They couldn't pump it out. There's even people looking at the oiler position. That's the guy that would go and check the king gauges to see how much water was actually inside the ship. They had gauges, but they couldn't read that in the pilot house. So did he do his job too? So I think that, it was just a catastrophe of all these things added up, and I think that the hatches definitely played a role in it, especially seeing the 2 that are folded in from the wave that came up. But that's not the crew's fault. That's a giant wave that came up. The question is, why didn't the Anderson sink? Here's a bigger ship that's behind them, and people tell me, well, 3 big waves would have been worse on the Anderson. It would have definitely sank that vessel. Why did it make it through? And the truth is, structural issues with the Fitzgerald, hatches leaking, bad decisions, budget cuts, all of that stuff did not play in. And a captain that knew that ship had troubles, and he still, went into storms repeatedly. 5 storms in 1975 alone, 5 gale force storms, and they knew they had damage. So yeah, there's easy blame to go to a captain, but that's easy for Rick, the armchair quarterback, to sit here and say that. I don't have the pressure of a company telling me, get the cargo through, Rick. You don't make money at anchor. What are you doing sitting, keeping it safe? So I totally get that as well. It's a pressure. But to sit there and blame the shipping companies on this, absolutely not. They did not want to lose an $8 million ship and 29 guys on board a freighter that were highly trained individuals. That is not worth a cargo of 26,000 tons of pellets. So yeah, I think that it's less of that and more of bravado, more of getting it through, and more of believing that your ship could do it, and every captain believed that. You're all awesome. Thanks for kicking off my year. I appreciate it.